any pretense that the president is anything less than consumed by legal pressure that's been building around him for nearly 2 weeks has shattered. The president appears to be really worried about something. He began the day with an hours-long 10-tweet tirade, laying bare his concerns when it comes to the multiple investigations into his business, campaign, and presidency, and potentially miring himself further in accusations of obstruction of justice. Take this tweet on White House counsel Don McGahn, a central witness in the Mueller investigation, whose ouster Trump announced yesterday in a tweet that came as a surprise even to McGahn. Trump today writing, quote, "The rigged Russia witch hunt did not come into play even a little bit with respect to my decision on Don McGahn." My decision. That's new. Is it an admission that Trump himself pushed McGahn out? For Trump, getting rid of a Mueller witness could take the obstruction of justice case against him from bad to worse. And that was just one tweet. The president also hit a host of other flashpoints in Mueller's investigation, including his reported attempts to fire Robert Mueller and Jeff Sessions, James Comey's testimony to Robert Mueller, and the Lester Holt interview where he admitted Russia was on his mind when he fired Comey. But some of the things he's ranting about, like Comey's testimony and the Lester Holt interview, aren't even in the news right now, which raises the question, what's really triggering Trump this time? Some point to this tweet for a possible answer. I just cannot state strongly enough how totally dishonest much of the media is. Truth doesn't matter to them. They only have their hatred and agenda. This includes fake books, which come out about me all the time, always anonymous sources, and are pure fiction. Enemy of the people. It could be another hint that another damaging story or damaging book is coming soon. And the timing couldn't be worse for Trump. Allies and advisors to the president warned the Washington Post he's unprepared for the legal challenges that lie ahead. Winter is coming, one aide told the Post. And at the top of their minds, impeachment. Rudy Giuliani even admitting, quote, "We've talked a lot about impeachment at different times." Joining us now from the Washington Post, White House reporter Ashley Parker, Paul Butler, former federal prosecutor, now Georgetown University law professor, Matt Miller, former chief spokesman for the Justice Department, Nick Confessori, New York Times political reporter, and Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the Associated Press. Jonathan, I'm curious. The president has gone on this 10-tweet tirade today. It seems like he's worried about something. The legal cloud is definitely darkening. It's closing in. What's happening right now?
Well, according to the aides that we've talked to, people close to the president, it is a succession of things. Let's remember, it's not been very long since he had that 1, 2, 3, 4 punch of Manafort, Cohen, Weisselberg, Pecker, all of these people suddenly either pleading guilty or suggesting there'd be some degree of cooperation. There's other stuff on the horizon. You hinted about a book. Bob Woodward's book is coming soon, next couple of weeks.
And what sort of access has he had?
He has had, they've been a little cagey about what they revealed, but he has had talked to a lot of people who were around the president who work in the White House. Certainly the Comey and Lester Holt pieces of his tweet storm this morning, those both would connect seemingly to the obstruction of justice part of this. So it's possible that in conversations with his lawyers, that is something that the president is particularly concerned about. It is all at once. And it's also, let's remember, Donald Trump isn't doing that much. There's no policy he's rolling out. There's no agenda he's trying to push. Right now, he is campaigning for the midterms, and he is in the White House in this cycle of feedback with cable television. And we know how he sees things on TV, he reacts to them, TV then reacts to him, and it goes on and on and on. And we saw some steam be let out this morning in the really remarkable tweet storm.
So is that a lot of executive time?
Yes.
Ashley Parker, Don McGahn, and that other tweet he sent out this morning saying it was his decision. Let's put it up on screen again. The rigged Russia witch hunt did not come into play even a little bit with respect to my decision on Don McGahn. The White House responded by saying that my decision on Don McGahn refers to the president's decision to accept the terms of the White House counsel's planned departure this fall. The official confirms that McGahn was not ousted and is leaving by choice. Does that line up with the reporting that you're doing?
Yes and no. So everybody sort of knew, and these pieces got written every several weeks, that Don McGahn was likely on his way out sometime this fall, likely or potentially after Kavanaugh's confirmation went through. But we also know that the president has long clashed with Don McGahn. He was deeply unhappy by news reports a week or two ago that McGahn had spent hours with Mueller in a way that Trump didn't fully realize until he learned that from the news. He's been frustrated with McGahn's handling of some parts of the Russia investigation. He thinks McGahn hasn't sufficiently protected him. And the president says he had sort of agreed to accept Don McGahn's resignation, but let's not forget that this resignation came as a surprise even to Mr. McGahn himself, who learned about it in the tweet, and that was described to me by people close to the president as the president kind of forcing his hand and saying, you know what, I'm done with you. We're ready to part ways. I'm going to put this out publicly in a slightly humiliating fashion, and so you're not going to have any wiggle room to maybe stay on should you change your mind.
Is it because he wants to be seen at all times like he is the one making the decisions?
It's a couple things. He likes to be the decider. He doesn't like feeling like he is forced into anything. As you know, oftentimes if the media reports he's going to do something and it's an accurate report, he will not do it or delay doing it just so it doesn't seem like he's doing what people claim he's going to do. And he and Don McGahn have clashed, and he was kind of ready for him to be gone, and he saw this as a way to publicly ensure that that does in fact happen.
Paul, how does someone like Special Counsel Robert Mueller see a tweet like that where he says, my decision?
Yeah, you know, you just put it in the pile with the rest. For a prosecutor who's thinking about an obstruction of justice case, Donald Trump is kind of a dream defendant because he constantly makes incriminating admissions in his tweets, in his interviews, and in his statements. And so what he said today, it's not quite as bad as when he said to Comey, can you give me a loyalty pledge? Or when he wrote that memo about the meeting with the Russian lawyer that was a complete lie. But this is yet more corroboration of his intent. His criminal intent, I'd say. He is running scared in this investigation, and he's doing everything he can to try to impede it.
Matt, do you think it's that simple that a tweet like this, or many tweets of this nature, are enough to lead Robert Mueller into an obstruction case, or does he need more than that?
I think with every action the president has taken, you look at a few that are the big actions that would form the heart of an obstruction case. The firing of Jim Comey, going to the intelligence community and asking them to get Comey to back off the Flynn investigation. But then there are a bunch of other series of actions that you would put together that collectively look like obstruction of justice and collectively show his intent. With respect to his tweet this morning, I think it would depend on what he was trying to accomplish. Is it true that he fired him because he was a witness in this case, or was it just the end of their natural tenure? At the minimum, the president was so reckless with his tweet because what he has done is given the special counsel a reason now to call White House witnesses that he may have been done with back in and say, what's happened over the last few weeks? Did the president tell you that he was going to fire Don McGahn because he came in and talked to me for 30 hours? Did he express anger about that? So whether or not that's what he did, he opened a new avenue of inquiry yet again.
What about the other tweets, and particularly this one, where he says, I'm very excited about the person who will be taking the place of Don McGahn as White House counsel. I like Don, but he was not responsible for me not firing Bob Mueller or Jeff Sessions. So much reporting and fake news. I'm confused by the construction of this tweet because is this him confirming that he did consider or did try to fire Bob Mueller or Jeff Sessions and McGahn wasn't the one who stopped him? Or is he saying that he never tried to do these things? Can you make sense of that?
It's hard to know. It looks a bit like an admission that he did it. It doesn't really matter, I think, whether he admits it or not, because we know that he did. And the special counsel knows that he did. The special counsel has interviewed all of the people that were in the room. He's spent 30 hours with Don McGahn. He's interviewed Reince Priebus. He's interviewed everyone that worked in the White House when the president did take these actions. I think one of the interesting things about Don McGahn, if you look at that tweet, I think the president has figured out that Don McGahn has been trying to build a get-out-of-jail-free card at Donald Trump's expense. Don McGahn was at the center of some of the early troubling actions. He was the one that talked to Sally Yates and said, why would the Justice Department care if Mike Flynn lied to the vice president about his contacts with Sergei Kislyak? He was the one who went to Jeff Sessions at the president's request and said, would you consider not recusing yourself in this case? I think he figured out early on he had legal exposure, and he spent a lot of time talking to the special counsel to make sure he got out of any legal jeopardy, and making clear that everyone in the world knew about it by a series of well-timed leaks to the New York Times.
And the reporting has been out there that because he felt he had exposure and because he felt that Donald Trump and his legal team was going to throw him under the bus, that he needed to be as transparent as possible. Now it's very clear the White House doesn't know exactly what McGahn said. There's this other reporting from your paper, Nick, that came out a few months ago, but I think it's worth bringing up again. This is about the president asking Don McGahn to fire Mueller, and then when the New York Times found out about it, he told McGahn to deny it, and McGahn had to say this. In one episode, the president told an aide that the White House counsel, Don McGahn, should issue a statement denying a New York Times article in January. The article said Mr. McGahn told investigators that the president once asked him to fire the special counsel, Robert Mueller. Mr. McGahn never released a statement and later had to remind the president that he had indeed asked Mr. McGahn to see that Mr. Mueller was dismissed, the People said.
Look, this is a president who's almost incapable of keeping a story straight for more than a day. He changes his story and he changes his motivations and his actions all the time. I think more broadly, just look at the toolkit with which Donald Trump constructed success in business and in politics. He used payoffs. He used fixers. He used NDAs, secrecy, right? These were all these tools that he used. They are all crumbling around him. He can't enforce the NDAs. His lawyers and his fixers are testifying or cooperating against him. And he can't buy his way into cooperation with some of the people who are against him. And his own inability to show loyalty to his own people is coming back to haunt him. They're all turning on him. That's a terrible place for him to be. I'm not at all surprised that he's firing off a machine gun of tweets all the time on 10 different topics.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.